Blood pooled on cracked concrete outside Wilmington Arms, 2 security guards never making it home, and whispers spreading faster than sirens. He wasn't supposed to be there. Wrong skin, wrong set, wrong life. But somehow, he stood with the Crips, driving Cadillacs, flashing tattoos, and pulling the kind of stunts that ended with bodies. This ain't about mascots or kids just playing gangster. This is about 7 white boys who crossed the line, earned colors, and left trails of headlines, indictments, and paranoia. From Compton projects to Bronx blocks, these are the stories of the 7 most dangerous white members in black gangs. To understand why these white faces stand out, you got to rewind to the late 1960s in Los Angeles, when the Crips first touched the streets. The Crips were born in South Central, in a world where young black kids felt boxed in by cops, poverty, and older street rivals, and the gang became both shield and sword in neighborhoods that felt forgotten. By the early 1970s, rival neighborhoods linked together and formed the Bloods, a crew defined as much by its opposition to the Crips as by any single leader or founding story. Back then, colors mattered more than anything because red and blue told the world which side you stood on. Sets like the Rollin' 60s, the Hoovers, and the Pyrus each held down their own blocks, and once you claimed, it was for life. Tattoos, hand signs, and rituals turned teenagers into soldiers, and by the mid-80s, Los Angeles was on fire with turf wars and drive-bys. The crack epidemic poured gasoline on everything because once money started flowing, every corner became a battlefield. It wasn't just the West Coast carrying that smoke though, because the East Coast soon built its own blood structure out of prison cells. In 1993, on Rikers Island, a gang leader named Leonard O.G. Deadeye McKenzie helped create the United Blood Nation. What started as a way to protect young black inmates from Crip domination in jail became a full network stretching through New York, New Jersey, and the Carolinas. The UBN had its own rules, called the 31, and its own council, with sets like the 9 Trey Gangsters or the Treetop Pyru carrying the name. By the late 1990s, UBN had tens of thousands of members, and the East Coast streets were now living under the same red flag that flew on the West. The Midwest wasn't quiet either, because places like Chicago, Detroit, and Minneapolis grew their own violent gang cultures. Chicago had the Gangster Disciples and the Black P. Stones, with wars over public housing projects and drug corners that claimed thousands of lives. Detroit had local crews like the Curry Gang during the cocaine years, feeding poison into neighborhoods while stacking cash. In Minneapolis, by the late 2000s, 2 local crews known as the Highs and the Bloods were tearing neighborhoods apart with shootings and carjackings. Even in places far from California, the names Blood and Crip carried weight, and young men lived or died under those colors. In all of these cities, membership was rooted in identity, race, and community. For black kids growing up under pressure, gangs became both a family and an army, which is why a white face inside that world always looked suspicious. Most of the time, white boys in the hood were hang-arounds, mascots, or informants, and they rarely lasted long. They stuck out too much, didn't understand the codes, and usually got exposed before they ever earned respect. Still, there were exceptions, and those exceptions are what this story is about. Some white boys forced their way in through pure violence, because nothing speaks louder in the streets than putting in work. Some brought money, resources, or cars that gangs needed, and that bought them a kind of strange protection. Others, like Richard White Boy Rick Wershey Jr. in Detroit, were pushed into gangs by law enforcement itself, used as teenage informants, and thrown into a world that eventually chewed them up. Wershey was only 14 when the FBI flipped him, and he ended up moving weight and living like a kingpin before the system left him to rot with a life sentence. His case became a Hollywood movie years later, but on the streets, he became the blueprint for how a white face could be used inside a black gang. What made it possible wasn't just desperation or curiosity. By the late 1980s and early 1990s, hip-hop culture had gone mainstream, and movies like Colors or Boys in the Hood made gang life look raw, but real. White suburban kids who were bored or rebellious started chasing that authenticity, and for a handful of them, the chase took them too far. Some ended up deep in sets that were supposed to keep outsiders out, proving themselves with blood or betrayal. Still, most white boys who tried to cross that line didn't make it. They got exposed, robbed, or just laughed out of the hood because gang culture wasn't built for outsiders. The ones who did make it left marks that can't be erased. They killed, they trafficked, They snitched, and sometimes they led whole crews even though they never looked the part. That is why their names echo in prison yards and headlines even today. Most white boys didn't last, but the ones who did left scars that remind everyone gangs don't always play by the rules people expect. Michael William Healey came into this world in 1975, born in Newark, New Jersey, to an Irish-American family that struggled with stability. His father worked construction jobs whenever he could find steady contracts, while his mother served as a nurse inside community hospitals around Essex County. Neighbors remembered a quiet boy who often kept to himself, but they also remembered a kid who carried anger inside him. Healey dropped out of high school before graduation and already had a reputation for fighting and drifting toward trouble in the streets. During the mid-'80s, Newark was already seeing the impact of drugs and violence, with young men falling into cliques for survival. Healey started listening heavy to early hip-hop, bumping records from Rakim, Big Daddy Kane, and NWA. According to stories from people around his block, he replayed movies like Colors and Menace II Society over and over. By the time he turned 17, his fascination with gang culture went from entertainment to lifestyle because he started hanging with blood sets already forming on the East Coast. What made him different was how deeply he tried to copy the language, the fashion, and the style of his black peers. He dressed in baggy khakis and red caps, and he copied the slang until people forgot he grew up Irish. Some of the homies joked by calling him White Mike, a name that stuck even when he grew older. Rumors say his first real introduction came during time in juvenile detention, where he was housed with young bloods already connected to Treetop Pie Rue leaders from Compton. Treetop Pie Rue started on Pie Rue Street in Compton during the early 1970s, and it became one of the main sets that later linked into the Bloods. The name came from the tall trees surrounding their hood, and by the late 80s, they were known across California for robberies, drug sales, and gunplay. When their members got locked up and moved through the prison system, the reach of Treetop Pie Rue extended outside California. By the 1990s, they had strong lines on the East Coast, recruiting inmates and then building sets in cities like Newark, Patterson, and Montclair. Michael Healey was one of the few white recruits accepted in these East Coast circles, and his reputation came from his willingness to use violence when asked. Court records later showed he was present during organized meetings where Treetop Pie Rue captains planned robberies and drug distribution. Healey learned that inside TTP, loyalty meant carrying out orders without hesitation, even when it meant putting in work against rivals. Wiretaps from the early 2000s captured his voice instructing younger members to greenlight a Crip who disrespected their block, though the target survived that attempt. The real turning point in his rise came from his involvement in murder cases that shook the East Coast TTP structure. In 2002, prosecutors linked him to the killing of a Bloods member identified as JC, who Healey suspected of cooperating with law enforcement. Witnesses testified that Healey approached JC in a parking lot and fired multiple shots into his head. One former associate told investigators that Healey bragged later, saying, "That's what happens to snitches." That single moment marked him as someone who would not hesitate to eliminate even his own allies if loyalty was questioned. By 2013, a bigger case landed on federal radar when a member known only as AS agreed to cooperate in a heroin trafficking investigation. Healey feared AS would testify and bring down the entire TTP operation in New Jersey, so he gave orders to take him out. The shooters moved sloppy and killed an innocent bystander first, then tracked down AS and finished the job. That hit placed Michael Healey at the center of a federal murder in aid of racketeering case because taking out a federal witness crossed into direct war with the government. Authorities eventually built their case using wiretaps, recorded conversations, and testimony from insiders who flipped. A former Treetop Pie Rue captain explained to investigators how Healey ranked within the set, issuing commands and collecting drug profits from Newark corners. Federal prosecutors revealed phone records, text messages, and undercover recordings that captured Healey using both racial slurs and blood vocabulary, switching language depending on who was around. That unpredictable mix made him feared because people never knew which version of him they would face. By 2018, federal agents finally arrested him, charging him with racketeering conspiracy, drug trafficking, conspiracy to murder a federal witness, and murder in aid of racketeering. At trial, prosecutors laid out his history of orchestrated violence, while defense lawyers tried to downplay his rank and argued he was scapegoated for being white in a black gang. The evidence proved too strong, and after 8 hours of deliberation, the jury convicted him on all counts. In 2023, he received multiple life sentences. The judge called him a soldier who twisted loyalty into a license to kill. The Department of Justice files painted Michael Healey like more than a soldier because the records described him as one of the men who gave orders. Those wiretap recordings captured his voice instructing subordinates to put in work, telling them who was green-lit and who was marked. Investigators described him as a white man who gained trust inside a blood set by making himself useful, violent, and unpredictable. Prosecutors argued that he used paranoia as both shield and weapon, striking at anyone suspected of betrayal. Inside prison, his reputation took on another life because inmates repeated stories that turned into folklore about the crazy white boy. One tale said that during a prison riot in the early 2000s, Healey held down a stairwell with a sharpened spear against a dozen rivals. Another rumor said he shaved his head, tattooed his face, and walked the tier shirtless just to unsettle both enemies and allies. Some called him Irish. Others stuck with White Mike. And even those who doubted the tales admitted he played his role convincingly. Former Treetop Pie Rue members told criminologist James Vinkman that Healey used theatrics to keep his enemies off balance. He made himself look reckless on purpose because in gang culture, unpredictability could scare rivals as much as raw firepower. Guards wrote incident reports about him trying to organize young inmates and even attempting to bribe staff. Reports described him as someone who thrived inside chaos, feeding off fear and confusion to strengthen his standing. During his trial, federal prosecutors highlighted that image, showing how Healey turned violence into currency. They presented intercepted calls where he bragged about checking anyone who challenged Treetop Pie Rue's authority. They argued he wasn't just following orders, he was issuing them, and that distinction placed him in the higher ranks. Jurors heard testimony from a former captain who flipped, describing how Healey pushed soldiers to handle business without hesitation. The witness explained that in TTP, loyalty meant action, and Healey was known for greenlighting fools who stepped wrong. The jury didn't take long to reach their verdict, and in 2018, he was convicted on charges that included racketeering and murder in aid of racketeering. His sentencing came later, in 2023, when the judge handed him multiple life sentences. The court described him as a man who corrupted loyalty and used belonging as an excuse for murder. Victim families spoke at the hearing, describing years of fear and grief caused by his actions. Healey showed little remorse, framing himself as a soldier who followed gang rules. Since that day, he has been housed at USP Victorville in California, a high-security federal penitentiary with a heavy gang presence. Reports say he continues to associate with Blood's members inside, still trying to hold influence despite his sentence. Some white inmates accused him of attempting to organize them separately, causing friction with both correctional officers and Blood's leaders. Staff wrote up incidents of extortion, bribery attempts, and intimidation, saying he never abandoned the playbook that made him notorious. In letters sent from prison, Healey claimed he was targeted by the government because he was white inside a black gang. He painted himself as a political prisoner, saying prosecutors exaggerated his role to make an example. That narrative never carried weight outside his circle, but it showed how he tried to reframe his downfall. On the outside, sociologists saw something different, pointing out how his rise reflected the way gangs sometimes value money and violence over racial lines. They said his place inside Treetop Pie Rue showed how desperation and loyalty could override suspicion. The truth sat somewhere in the middle because Michael Healey proved that whiteness could be both advantage and liability. Some insiders said his skin helped him move unnoticed by police during certain missions, while others said his race made him stand out during investigations. His case raised questions about how gangs adapt when outsiders bring resources or reckless loyalty. Treetop Pie Rue had a history rooted in resistance to Crip expansion, and Healey joined that history by becoming a soldier who enforced order through violence. Stories inside prison kept growing, with legends of him brandishing weapons, flipping tables, or threatening guards with smirks. Whether true or exaggerated, those stories reinforced the image of a man who thrived on intimidation. Younger inmates repeated his name like a warning, using "crazy white boy" as shorthand for unpredictable danger. It showed how reputation inside the walls could matter as much as the case that brought you there. On the streets, people still argued about how real his status was inside Treetop Pie Rue. Some said he earned stripes by eliminating rivals and suspected snitches. Others believed he only rose because he was reckless enough to do what others hesitated to do. Either way, he became one of the rare white men to be fully absorbed into a blood set, carrying out sanctioned murders and running drug corners in Newark and beyond. The legend of White Mike forced people to reconsider the boundaries that gangs drew around race and membership. He wasn't some mascot standing on the edge or some privileged suburban kid chasing thrills. He was a man who ordered murders, ran narcotics, and turned paranoia into a career inside one of the most violent blood sets on the East Coast. His rise showed that when money and violence take priority, racial barriers sometimes crumble. For the government, his conviction sent a message that even inside a black gang, whiteness would not shield a man from life sentences. For sociologists, his story became a study in how whiteness operates differently depending on context. For prison culture, his name became another piece of lore about intimidation, violence, and survival. When people spoke about Michael Healey, they didn't talk about him like an outsider pretending to belong. They spoke about him like someone who pulled rank inside Treetop Pie Rue. They said he didn't just talk tough because in TTP, you greenlight fools when you have to. And White Mike, he pulled rank. Michael Healey showed how Treetop Pie Rue opened its doors for a white soldier who proved himself through violence and paranoia. On the opposite side of Los Angeles County, another story unfolded in Compton, where the blue flag of the Crips shaped an entirely different type of legend. That story belonged to David Goldie Livingston, the lone white member of the Park Village Crips, a set defined by both Samoan and black identity. Compton had been ground zero for Crip and blood warfare since the mid-70s, with every street carrying its own set and history. The Park Village Crips held down territory around Wilmington Avenue and El Segundo Boulevard, an area built on working-class housing projects and overcrowded apartments. What made Park Village stand out was the heavy presence of Samoan families, many of whom migrated during the 1970s. The Samoan boys came strong, bigger than most, and they quickly built reputations as enforcers inside the set. By the mid-80s, Park Village had become a force respected across Compton, with their ranks split between Samoan and black members. In that world, seeing a white face inside Park Village was unheard of because membership was locked tight around culture, kinship, and community. That is why David Livingston stood out the moment he started hanging around the projects. People said he showed up driving a Cadillac, blasting NWA and smoking like he was born into the block. His pale skin and slick blonde hair didn't match the backdrop, but his tattoos and attitude slowly carved him a spot. They called him Goldie, a name that stuck because he rocked gold accessories and moved flashy like a hustler. Goldie built a reputation as someone who did not care about fitting in politely. He dressed in blue khakis, kept a .357 revolver tucked in his waistband, and flashed Park Village signs in public. He inked gang symbols on his body, including PVC initials across his arm, and surrounded himself with Samoan homies who vouched for him. Some said his acceptance came because he handled robberies without hesitation, putting in work that proved his loyalty. Others believed his connection started through a Samoan girlfriend who introduced him deeper into the set. Whatever the reason, by the early 90s, David Goldie Livingston was recognized as the only known white member of the Park Village Crips. People who knew him back then said he was reckless, aggressive, and constantly looking to show he wasn't soft. He spent time rolling through Compton streets in his Cadillac, sometimes packed with other members, sometimes solo, but always armed. He started carrying the reputation of a crazy white boy who was unpredictable and eager for violence. That reputation hardened in 1994 when Goldie was tied to one of the most shocking double murders in Compton history. The crime took place at the Wilmington Arms apartments, a housing complex known for constant tension between residents and outsiders. On the night of August 21, 1994, two security guards, Juan Torres and Ruben Pineda, were patrolling the property. Both men were immigrants from Mexico, fathers working long hours to support their families, and they were not affiliated with any gangs. Witnesses later told investigators that Livingston and two other Park Village members confronted the guards after being ordered to leave the property. Words escalated quickly because Goldie felt disrespected by being checked in front of residents. According to court transcripts, he pulled a handgun and shot both men at close range, killing them instantly. Blood stained the stairwell, and panic spread through Wilmington Arms as residents hid inside their units. The murders carried no strategic purpose, only rage and impulse, which made them even more frightening. Police moved fast because the killings of two security guards in uniform threatened to spark community outrage. Detectives gathered witness statements and linked Livingston's Cadillac to the scene, eventually arresting him within weeks. In custody, he carried himself with bravado, telling officers that Park Village would ride for him no matter what. Prosecutors charged him with 2 counts of first-degree murder, using eyewitnesses, ballistics, and his own reckless admissions to build their case. Court records from 1995 showed the prosecution pushing hard for the death penalty, arguing that killing 2 working men in uniform showed special circumstances. During trial, witnesses described how Livingston bragged about the shooting, claiming he took out 2 lames who disrespected him. His defense tried to paint him as someone caught in the wrong place, saying the Samoan homies framed him to save themselves. The jury didn't buy it because the evidence tied the gun and the car directly to him. By the end of the trial, David Goldie Livingston was convicted of 2 counts of first-degree murder. The jury found special circumstances of multiple murders, which qualified him for the death penalty. In 1996, he was sentenced to death and sent to San Quentin State Prison, where he has remained on death row for almost 3 decades. Court transcripts captured the chilling words of the judge, who said Livingston executed 2 men whose only mistake was doing their jobs. Livingston's sentence placed him among the small number of white men who entered black gangs and ended up condemned to death for carrying out violence under that flag. His case became a rare example of how gang loyalty, rage, and reputation could drive someone past any boundary of reason. In Compton, his name faded compared to larger sets and bigger legends, but inside prison he became another story, whispered across tears. Inmates described him as the white Crip from Park Village who shot 2 security guards over a moment of disrespect. David Goldie Livingston showed how desperation and rage could push a white man into death row under the Crip flag. Almost 2 decades later, another white kid landed in the same Crip universe, but his road there looked nothing like Goldie's. Instead of Compton housing projects, Cameron Charles Terrell grew up in Palos Verdes, a coastal city sitting high above Los Angeles, where the view stretched across the Pacific Ocean and the streets stayed quiet. Palos Verdes was one of the wealthiest communities in California, home to CEOs, doctors, and athletes who spent millions on cliffside houses. Cameron's father was an executive at a major advertising firm, while his mother was active in local charities. He grew up with private school uniforms, weekend soccer matches, and luxury vacations. By the time he turned 16, he was already driving his parents' Mercedes-Benz around the gated neighborhoods, a lifestyle completely different from kids in South Central. Despite his privilege, Cameron gravitated toward the culture he saw in music videos, rap lyrics, and the streets of Los Angeles. Friends said he often skipped hanging with his classmates to spend time in South LA, where he made connections with members of the Rollin' 90s neighborhood Crips. The Rollin' 90s controlled turf around Hyde Park and Inglewood, a neighborhood far removed from Palos Verdes mansions. At 17, he was introduced as an outsider, a white suburban kid curious about the life. The homies started calling him Milk, a nickname tied to his pale skin. Others just called him White Boy, and at first most believed he would never last. Cameron's difference came from what he brought to the table. He had money, a car, and access to technology, things that gave him value inside the crew. He drove homies around in his Mercedes, paid for food, and filmed them rapping or throwing up signs on his phone. That access built trust, slowly pulling him deeper into a set that usually never opened for outsiders. Cameron leaned in fully, cutting his blonde hair shorter, sagging his jeans, and adopting the slang of the neighborhood. He skipped classes at Palos Verdes High School, spending entire days cruising through Hyde Park with his new friends. On social media, he began posting cryptic messages, rap lyrics, and videos of himself throwing up signs. Parents of his classmates noticed the change and whispered about the rich kid who started acting like he was banging. The Rolling 90s carried a long history in Los Angeles, linked with alliances to Rolling 60s, and constant beef with rival gangs like 8 Trey gangsters. By 2017, shootings had been escalating across Hyde Park, with teenagers carrying guns and funerals marking weekends. Cameron stepped into that world not as a bystander, but as someone trying to prove himself useful. His role was simple, but dangerous. Drive the car, film the moves, and show loyalty through action. On October 1st, 2017, that loyalty was tested during one of the deadliest moments in his young life. According to police reports and court documents, Cameron drove his father's black Mercedes into Hyde Park with 2 Rollin' 90s members riding with him. Their target was a young man named Justin Holmes, a 21-year-old affiliated loosely with rivals in the area. As Holmes walked near the 7800 block of Western Avenue, gunfire erupted from the passenger side of Cameron's car. Holmes collapsed, bleeding out on the sidewalk, while Cameron hit the gas and sped away. Witnesses later identified the car, describing a shiny black Mercedes that stood out in a neighborhood filled with older sedans and beat-up Chevys. Detectives quickly traced the vehicle back to Cameron's family, and within days he was arrested along with the two shooters. The arrest shocked Los Angeles because people couldn't understand how a 17-year-old from Palos Verdes ended up charged with gang murder. The Los Angeles Times ran headlines calling him the rich kid Crip, while parents from his school refused to believe he had any connection to gangs. As the case moved forward, prosecutors presented evidence that Cameron was more than just a passenger. They revealed videos from his phone showing him hanging with Rolling 90s members, throwing up gang signs and rapping about catching bodies. Another clip showed him laughing as a memorial cross for Justin Holmes was destroyed, a moment that prosecutors said demonstrated callousness and disrespect. Those videos turned him from an innocent bystander into an active participant, a suburban kid who helped celebrate a killing. In court filings, prosecutors argued that Cameron's Mercedes was more than transportation. It was a status symbol that gave his crew an advantage. Driving a luxury car allowed them to move through neighborhoods without raising immediate suspicion, because few expected gang members to be rolling in a high-end vehicle. Detectives testified that the Mercedes became a key detail, tying Cameron directly to the murder scene. His privilege, the same thing that gave him value inside the set, became the very evidence that put him on trial for his life. The case drew national media attention because it represented a clash between privilege and street violence. Reporters filled the courtroom daily, writing about a blonde-haired teenager in expensive suits listening to testimony about gang life and homicide. Neighbors from Palos Verdes packed benches, shaking their heads while mothers from Hyde Park wept in the same room. For the city, the trial felt like a collision of two completely different worlds connected only by blood spilled on Western Avenue. The trial of Cameron Terrell quickly turned into one of the most unusual gang murder cases Los Angeles had seen in years. Reporters highlighted not only the evidence, but also the sheer cost of his defense. His parents secured a legal team that demanded bail be set, and in late 2017, a judge shocked many by approving release on a $5 million bond. Few gang defendants ever saw freedom while facing first-degree murder charges. Yet Cameron returned home to Palos Verdes, while his co-defendants sat in county jail cells. During that time, Cameron carried himself differently than most defendants, because instead of hiding away, he appeared in public. Photos surfaced of him attending a World Series game at Dodger Stadium while his case was still pending. He wore a Dodgers cap, smiling in the crowd, surrounded by fans unaware they were sitting beside a teenager charged with a gang killing. For families of Hyde Park, the sight felt like mockery, because while mothers buried sons, the rich kid Crip enjoyed baseball like nothing happened. Court transcripts later showed how his defense team crafted a story of naivety, arguing that Cameron was a misguided suburban kid caught in something bigger than himself. They emphasized that he never pulled the trigger, never fired a shot, and that his role was simply being in the wrong place at the wrong time. His lawyers told jurors that he was fascinated by hip-hop culture, not committed to gang life, and that the videos prosecutors used against him were youthful mistakes. In 2018, after weeks of testimony, the jury returned a verdict that stunned the courtroom. Cameron Terrell was acquitted of all charges, walking free while the two shooters faced convictions that carried life sentences. Gas filled the gallery as family members of Justin Holmes broke down, believing justice had been twisted by privilege and money. The judge read the verdict, and Cameron hugged his attorneys before leaving through the side exit, shielded from the press by his parents. The backlash came instantly, with commentators and community leaders calling the case an example of white boy privilege. They pointed out that no young black man from Hyde Park would ever post bail, attend sporting events, and then walk free after being tied to a getaway car in a murder. Activists demanded answers, saying the legal system once again gave leniency to a wealthy white defendant while condemning his black peers to life sentences. Families in Hyde Park never forgot the videos that showed him mocking Justin Holmes' memorial cross. For them, acquittal felt like erasure because the actions were recorded, the car was present, and the disrespect was undeniable. The Los Angeles Times ran op-eds about racial bias in courts, while national outlets debated whether Terrell's case showed systemic inequities. On social media, his name trended briefly, with users posting memes comparing his freedom to the lifelong punishments faced by young black defendants in similar cases. After acquittal, Cameron Terrell disappeared from public view, choosing silence instead of the attention he once embraced. Rumors spread that he entered a witness protection program, though court records never confirmed relocation. Others whispered that his family sent him out of state to avoid retaliation because the rolling 90s Crips were furious over how his case drew unwanted heat. Some sources even suggested he enrolled quietly in a university, possibly studying law with dreams of flipping his story into a career. What became clear was that his name never surfaced again in police blotters or gang reports, meaning he left the streets entirely. For Hyde Park, the memory of that night stayed fresh because the car he drove carried shooters who ended a life and destroyed families. Justin Holmes's relatives visited his grave while the driver walked free in the hills of Palos Verdes, a contrast that stung even years later. Cameron Terrell became a symbol of how privilege intersected with gang life in ways few expected. He wasn't raised in poverty or forced into violence. He stepped into it willingly, chasing authenticity and thrill until it cost a young man his life. Even if the jury said he wasn't guilty, the streets held their own verdict, labeling him forever as the kid who brought his Mercedes into Hyde Park like a hearse. Cameron Terrell walked away from a courtroom with his freedom intact, but the city of Compton held a different story about another white face inside a black set. This one didn't grow up in mansions or private schools because Aaron Hammer was raised inside a working-class white family in Compton itself. His father worked odd construction jobs, his mother took shifts as a clerk at local stores, and the family barely kept the lights on. Unlike Cameron, Aaron wasn't an outsider driving in from Palos Verdes. He was already planted in the neighborhoods where gangs decided how kids lived and died. The Southside Compton Crips dominated the streets around Wilmington Avenue and 134th Street, a set with long history and constant conflict with Bloods and rival Crip cliques. By the late 1990s, Aaron started hanging around corners where blue flags flew, desperate for acceptance in an environment that never viewed him as natural. His pale skin stood out on blocks where everyone else shared roots tied to Compton history, but his persistence made him visible. Older homies laughed at first, calling him Snowball because of his skin, later switching to Mascot, a name that stuck even heavier. That label carried double meaning because to some he was nothing more than a novelty, a white boy who made the crew laugh. To others, he was someone eager enough to take risks that other youngsters avoided. He drove stolen cars, carried pistols for older members, and showed up at house parties flashing gang signs. Police records from the early 2000s listed him as a known associate of the Southside Compton Crips, though detectives often wrote him off as a hanger-on. Still, the homies kept him close, using him when they needed someone reckless. Everything changed in September 2003, when a night of gunfire tied his name to one of the most shocking tragedies in Compton's history. On the evening of September 14, Serena and Venus Williams' half-sister, Yetunde Price, drove through Compton with her boyfriend, Roland Wormley. As they pulled onto East Greenleaf Boulevard, shots rang out from the sidewalk, fired by men associated with the Southside Compton Crips. Price, a 31-year-old mother of three, was struck in the head by a bullet, and the car sped away before crashing into a parked vehicle. She died shortly after, leaving her family shattered and the sports world stunned. Investigators quickly tied the shooting to a group of Southside Compton Crips who had been posted up on the block that night. Among the names that surfaced were Robert Edward Maxfield and Aaron Hammer. Witnesses claimed Hammer fired shots alongside Maxfield, though the fatal bullet was later attributed to Maxfield's weapon. Prosecutors charged both men with murder, placing Hammer in the headlines as the white Crip accused of killing the sister of two global tennis icons. For the first time, his Mascot nickname carried weight far beyond neighborhood jokes. When the case reached trial, Aaron Hammer's defense lawyers built a strategy that leaned heavy on his skin color and background. They told the jury that Hammer was never a true Crip, only a confused white kid trying to fit in. In their argument, the Southside Compton Crips laughed at him, used him as a tag-along, and never trusted him with serious work. The lawyers claimed he was more mascot than member, someone who craved validation but lacked authority. That image, painted carefully in court, shifted the weight of evidence. Prosecutors tried connecting Hammer directly to the bullet that killed Yetunde Price, but ballistics proved the fatal round came from Robert Maxfield's weapon. Witness testimony described Hammer firing into the car, yet the defense convinced jurors that his role was exaggerated. His lawyers pressed that he carried a gun, but lacked the mindset of a real gangster, suggesting he fired recklessly without understanding consequences. That framing carried enough doubt for the court to dismiss his murder charge. In the end, Hammer escaped the fate of Maxfield, who accepted a plea and was sentenced to 15 years in prison. Instead, Hammer was convicted on weapons charges, receiving a sentence that kept him locked up for far less time. News reports highlighted the split outcome, noting how the white defendant avoided a murder conviction while his black co-defendant bore the heavier weight. Inside Compton, the verdict sparked debates about whether justice truly landed where it belonged. Rumors spread quickly that Hammer gave up information behind closed doors, trading testimony or details in exchange for lighter punishment. No official record proved cooperation, but whispers in the yard carried stronger weight than paperwork. Some claimed he identified cars used in other shootings, while others said he quietly testified in sealed hearings. Whether true or not, the rumors poisoned his name in Southside Compton Crip circles. By the time he walked out of prison, Aaron Hammer was no longer seen as loyal or dependable. Former associates labeled him a liability, the white boy who talked too much when pressure came down. For a gang that prized silence above all else, that reputation left him isolated. He faded from Compton streets, disconnected from the set he once begged to join, carrying the label of snitch whether or not the paperwork backed it. The bigger lesson from Hammer's story showed the fragile role of token white members inside black gangs. His nickname, Mascot, captured exactly how most viewed him, because he represented curiosity more than respect. He gained entry by being reckless and available, not by heritage or neighborhood bonds. When the spotlight hit, his whiteness became both shield and curse. In court, it saved him from a murder conviction because jurors bought the story that he was too much of an outsider to be truly dangerous. On the block, it marked him forever as untrustworthy, a man who only lasted as long as others found him useful. People in Compton told his story as a cautionary tale, a reminder that chasing stripes through borrowed identity rarely ends well. Hammer's role in the death of Yetunde Price stained him permanently, but his legal outcome highlighted how privilege sometimes shapes verdicts. Even when labeled clown or mascot, his gun still fired bullets into a car, and a mother never came home to her children. Aaron Hammer showed what it looked like when a white Crip carried the nickname of Mascot and ended up discarded by the same set that once vouched for him. The next story takes us far from Compton and into the mountains of West Virginia, where another white kid grew up under broken ceilings and found himself sliding into darker roads. His name was Thaddius Snow, and his rise inside the 9 trade gangsters proved that some white boys didn't just hang around, they built empires that left scars on everyone around them. Thaddius came into this world in 1989, born in a coal mining town outside Charleston, West Virginia. His childhood was marked by empty fridges, parents arguing over bills, and nights where the lights went out because the power company cut service. His father left early, drifting away into another family, and his mother worked long shifts in diners, often leaving him to raise himself. Teachers described him as restless and quick-tempered, the type of boy who disappeared from classrooms and showed up in juvenile halls instead. By 14, he was already shoplifting, breaking into cars and moving in and out of detention. The streets of West Virginia didn't have large gang structures like Los Angeles or New York, but they had poverty, meth, and enough crime to teach survival lessons. Thaddius learned how to hustle small amounts of weed and pills, carrying knives and bragging about robberies. By the time he turned 18, he carried scars from fights and a reputation as someone who never backed down. Yet his ambition stretched beyond petty hustling because he craved something bigger, something that gave him identity and control. That craving pulled him south into Virginia, where he moved after a short stint living with extended family. In Virginia, he met a girlfriend who carried direct ties to the 9 trade gangsters, one of the most feared blood sets on the East Coast. 9 Trey originated inside Rikers Island during the early 1990s as part of the United Blood Nation, and by the 2000s, they spread deep through Virginia, North Carolina, and beyond. His girlfriend introduced him to members who tested his loyalty, expecting him to wash out like other outsiders. Instead, Thaddius stayed and proved himself by carrying out violent tasks for the set. Stories say his first real initiation came when he beat a man nearly unconscious with brass knuckles, leaving witnesses stunned at how far he pushed himself just to belong. The gang first called him Storm, a nickname tied to his explosive temper and the way he attacked without hesitation. Over time, the nickname shifted, and many began calling him simply White Boy, because his skin made him stand out even as his actions made him feared. From there, Thaddius rose fast, not only because of his violence, but because of his ability to organize money. He realized that drugs brought heat, but sex trafficking brought both cash and control. According to federal indictments, he began recruiting vulnerable women, many already addicted to opioids, promising protection and quick money before trapping them inside a system of abuse. His empire stretched across Virginia and West Virginia, with motels serving as bases where women were forced to work under his control. Victim testimonies later painted chilling details. Women described being locked inside rooms with no exits, beaten when they refused clients, and forced to hand over every dollar. One woman testified that he swung a bat wrapped in barbed wire during punishments, striking walls and sometimes bodies to keep fear alive. Others claimed he kept a python snake inside one of his apartments, threatening to release it on women who disobeyed him. Whether every detail was true or exaggerated, the stories built his legend as someone who turned cruelty into a business. Federal investigators later explained that Thaddius ran his trafficking operation like a cartel cell, using lieutenants to manage women, drivers to transport them, and armed members to collect money. Wiretaps revealed him bragging about breaking women so they would never leave, language that prosecutors highlighted during trial. His empire pulled in tens of thousands of dollars monthly, money that he used to buy weapons, cars, and loyalty inside the 9-tray ranks. Law enforcement described his operation as one of the most brutal trafficking rings uncovered in Virginia during the 2010s. His name started appearing in both police reports and street whispers because people in Norfolk, Richmond, and Roanoke knew about the white 9-tray boss who used violence as both a tool and a warning. Local newspapers ran stories when indictments first dropped, calling him the ringleader of a modern slavery enterprise that left entire families broken. By 2017, the FBI had already placed Thaddius Snow on its radar because reports from local police showed patterns too big to ignore. Multiple counties across Virginia and West Virginia described similar stories, young women turning up beaten, homeless, and terrified to testify against the man they called White Boy. Federal task forces began piecing together motel receipts, phone records, and social media posts that tied him directly to the trafficking network. Wiretaps captured his voice demanding cash and threatening violence if women tried to escape. Victim testimonies became the backbone of the case because women who once feared him finally spoke under federal protection. In one hearing, a victim described being forced to work every night, sometimes for 10 men, while armed gang members stood outside the door. Another told the jury about the python, explaining how Snow used the snake to terrorize her when she resisted. Others mentioned the barbed wire bat, a weapon prosecutors brought into court as evidence of intimidation. These testimonies built a picture of control so brutal that even hardened investigators admitted they were shaken. In March 2019, a federal grand jury indicted Snow on charges of sex trafficking by force, fraud, and coercion, along with racketeering tied to 9-tray operations. Court documents listed more than a dozen victims, stretching across multiple states, with prosecutors estimating hundreds of thousands of dollars in profit. The indictment described him as the leader of a violent criminal enterprise, one who used loyalty to 9-tray as both cover and weapon. Facing overwhelming evidence, Snow entered a plea deal in 2020, admitting to key trafficking charges in exchange for avoiding a trial that could have brought life sentences. The federal judge handed down a 40-year sentence, locking him away until at least 2060. For victims, the sentence brought some closure, but many said the scars he left would never fade. Prosecutors called the case one of the worst trafficking rings in Virginia history, highlighting how his cruelty made him feared even beyond gang circles. Snow's race shaped every stage of his rise and downfall because it gave him advantages and disadvantages at the same time. On the streets, his whiteness made him stand out, earning him nicknames and suspicion until he proved his loyalty with violence. But in suburbs and rural towns, his skin gave him cover, because police never expected a white man to be the leader of a blood-set trafficking women across state lines. Former agents said he moved more freely than black gang leaders, renting motels and crossing borders without immediate attention. That camouflage delayed his capture, buying him years to expand his network before the FBI finally closed in. Inside 9-tray, his whiteness turned into both asset and liability. Some members respected him for the money he brought in, calling him White Boy with a mix of sarcasm and fear. Others doubted him, whispering that he would eventually break under federal pressure. When his plea deal came down, those doubts only grew because the set lost one of its biggest moneymakers while hearing rumors that he gave up inside details. Whether he snitched or not, his 40-year sentence removed him from the streets entirely. For the outside world, His case stood as proof that 9 Trey's name wasn't just tied to hip-hop headlines. The same set that became famous through Tekashi 6ix9ine's rainbow hair and public drama also carried a hidden side, one built on exploitation and cruelty. In Virginia and West Virginia, it wasn't Tekashi who terrified women and families. It was a white boss named Snow who ran the ugliest business under the 9 Trey flag. Thaddius Snow's story showed how the 9 Trey name could stretch far beyond New York, with one white boss turning Virginia motels into cages for women. Hundreds of miles away, in the cold streets of Minneapolis, another white figure surfaced, but his lane looked different. Instead of sex trafficking, Nathan Walls became tied to the pipeline that connected rural meth labs to black gangs moving product through the city. His reputation grew not because he looked like a leader, but because he served as the link between two worlds that rarely trusted each other. Minneapolis carried its own gang culture long before Walls showed up in indictments. The city was split by rival crews known as the Highs and the Bloods, names that dominated North Minneapolis housing projects during the 1990s and 2000s. The Highs took their name from the Highland area, building cliques that stacked numbers through neighborhood ties. The Bloods represented the red flag imported from Los Angeles through prison connections, growing strong enough to challenge rivals across multiple blocks. Shootings between the Highs and the Bloods shaped years of violence, with teenagers carrying pistols on corners while families ducked stray bullets inside apartments. That environment created demand for drugs, and meth surged alongside cocaine and heroin as a source of fast money. Unlike the crack trade in Los Angeles, meth production in Minnesota often came from rural white towns, where barns and basements doubled as labs. Small towns outside Minneapolis became hotspots for cheap meth, and that supply eventually flowed into the hands of gangs in the city. Law enforcement always suspected that white producers supplied black distributors, but rarely did investigators catch someone who played both sides as clearly as Nathan Walls. Walls grew up in Prior Lake, a suburb south of Minneapolis known more for fishing and quiet neighborhoods than gang activity. He came from a working-class white family, described by neighbors as average, not wealthy, not starving. But addiction caught him early, first with weed, then pills, then meth. By his late teens, he had dropped out of school, spending days chasing highs and nights running with petty criminals. Police records from the early 2000s listed him for minor drug possession and stolen cars, but nothing that stood out. His size earned him the nickname Fat Nate, because he carried extra weight that made him noticeable. Among Blood associates, he was sometimes called Fat Blood, while others referred to him as White Boy Nate. Those names reflected both ridicule and acceptance, because while he stood out as an outsider, he stayed close enough to serve a purpose. He was the guy who knew people in rural counties, the one who could make connections with white suppliers without raising suspicion. According to federal indictments, Walls eventually became a trusted connector between meth producers in towns like Shakopee and distributors inside Minneapolis blood sets. His role was not about being the toughest soldier, but about being useful, because usefulness often outweighed image inside the underworld. Wiretaps later captured him arranging pickups, moving pounds of meth into the city, and delivering cash back out to rural labs. Investigators claimed he even used his family's vehicles to move product, hiding bags under seats and in spare tires. By 2023, his name appeared in one of the largest RICO cases filed against Minneapolis gangs in years. Federal prosecutors indicted 30 members and associates linked to the Bloods, charging them with racketeering, firearms trafficking, and large-scale meth distribution. Nathan Walls was listed among the defendants, accused of serving as a pipeline between small-town producers and gang members who sold the product on Minneapolis streets. Court papers described him as an associate who leveraged his race and connections to facilitate transactions otherwise difficult to arrange. The indictment also tied Walls to firearms, alleging that he moved guns in exchange for drugs, supplying both sides of the trade. Agents seized rifles, handguns, and extended magazines linked to his network, saying he was part of the reason Minneapolis saw spikes in shootings during 2021 and 2022. One prosecutor told local press that the case highlighted how suburban connectors kept gang economies alive, moving resources across lines that outsiders rarely notice. For investigators, Walls became an example of how whiteness sometimes offered camouflage inside an economy that usually stayed closed to outsiders. As of 2025, Nathan Walls' case remains tied up in federal court, with hearings delayed and evidence still stacking against him. Prosecutors continue pressing racketeering charges, saying he was a vital piece of the Bloods meth network, while defense attorneys argue he was only a user who got in too deep. Either way, the weight of a RICO dragnet hangs heavy because if convicted, Walls could face decades in federal prison. The courtroom arguments highlight the role race played in his rise. On one side, prosecutors claim he used his whiteness as camouflage, moving comfortably in rural towns where cops never suspected him of hauling drugs. Motel managers and gas station attendants thought he looked like another small-town local, not a gang associate tied to the Bloods. That camouflage gave him freedom black members never enjoyed because his face didn't trigger the same scrutiny. On the other side, distrust followed him inside Minneapolis. Some Blood members accepted him as Fat Nate because he brought steady product, but others saw him as a liability. Whispers spread that he couldn't be trusted in the long run because when pressure came, white boys like him broke first. That suspicion limited how far he could rise, keeping him in the role of connector instead of leader. His job was never running sets, it was moving goods, and that position left him exposed when the feds came knocking. Community reaction has been split since his indictment. Families in Prior Lake struggle to reconcile the image of a local kid with the federal charges that painted him as a key gang figure. Meanwhile, residents in North Minneapolis see his case as proof that meth connections aren't just inner-city problems, but pipelines stretching across racial and geographic lines. His story underlined the uneasy truth that the meth economy thrived precisely because it bridged worlds that rarely trusted each other. For Nathan Walls, the bridge he built became his undoing. What started as access turned into indictment, and what looked like opportunity became a federal nightmare. Whether he walks free or ends up sentenced, his name will remain tied to the RICO case that exposed how rural labs and city gangs fed each other's survival. Across decades, the faces changed, but the pattern stayed. White boys who found their way into black gangs never walked clean, because each name left scars and suspicions behind. Michael Healey turned Treetop Pyru into his stage for violence. David Goldie Livingston carried Park Village Crips into death row. Cameron Terrell drove his Mercedes through Hyde Park and walked free. Aaron Hammer fired shots that ended a sister's life. Thaddius Snow built an empire of cruelty inside 9 Trey. And Nathan Walls carried meth across Minnesota like a courier of chaos. For every story, whiteness worked as both armor and target. It opened doors in rural towns, shielded suspects in courtrooms, and sometimes fooled the system. But inside the sets, it carried distrust because the same thing that brought camouflage also marked weakness when pressure came. Those who lasted did it through violence, money, or reckless loyalty, but none escaped without turning into symbols of paranoia. The legends still circulate, half fact and half street memory. Some became whispers inside prison tiers, others turned into headlines that never faded, and all of them proved the same truth. Being the white face in a black gang never made the story smaller, it made it heavier, because every move stood out and every mistake echoed louder. The white shadow inside black gangs was never just another homie. It was a spectacle, a suspicion, and sometimes the spark that set everything on fire.